And then on one particular page, right in that section, it hits him like an explosion. And that's the word that Faulkner writes. It's an explosion. He knows what he can do to correct the situation, what is being asked of him, what is even being called to do. And what is his solution? He
Yeah, to just get a bigger house and more land than this guy had.
yeah, in other words, become like the man in the hammock. Now, but this is the thing. This is the careful thing that Faulkner makes us push at.
Hello, welcome to the Big Book Project. I'm Lori Feathers, and again, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Larry Allums, and we are discussing Chapter 7 of Absalom by William Faulkner. Hey, Larry, how are you?
All right, how are you, Lori?
I'm really well. Thanks so much. Well, we've got a task set out for us today, trying to uh, capture everything that happens in this very eventful chapter 7, in which we hear Thomas Sutpen's backstory.
Yes, we do. And the only thing easy about it is that it pretty much falls into two parts, that sort of divide this chapter into two. So that's one of the ways that I kind of try to keep it straight anyway. But boy, this is a part of the book where you're flipping back and forth between pages and saying, wait a minute, what did I read over here? And then, going back to where you're reading and things like that. So, and you really begin to realize, especially in this chapter, just how complex it is, and not just keeping up with the way Faulkner writes it, but some central facts of the story. And I was thinking earlier today that if there are two main facts that have to do with the drama with Sutpen and Charles Bond and Judith and Henry, it has to do with two questions really. And the first one has to do with, and they're basically two taboos. One is a timeless and universal taboo, and that has to do with incest, right? And then and that figures with Judith and Charles, right? Do they know that they're brother and sister, or do they not know it? Who knows exactly that they are? And then the other has to do with a taboo in the Deep South, and widespread in the world, but not universal, and that is the business of color. Is Charles black? Does he have any black blood in him? And of course, we know that if he did have black blood, even though he looked perfectly white, if he had black blood in him, then he would not be of the status of white people at that time. So those two things, right? Race and and kinship. Those two things really loom large as we go. So I have to keep reminding myself of that.
Well, I also think one thing that is a fascinating question that Sutpen raises when he's talking to Grandfather Compson and relating all this story is whether or not Charles Bond knew that Thomas Sutpen was his dad, and whether this was some kind of revenge plot that was just years in the making, that they were just kind of waiting, and he intentionally befriended Henry by intentionally going to the same college. And it's a really intriguing question to think about who knew what and when, I guess.
Exactly. And just the very fact that you mentioned, that Henry did not know Charles at all before he met him at school. So his presence at school was engendered somehow, thought of by Charles. And why? Why did he decide that he was going to go to a school? He's several years older than Henry. He's not undergraduate age, and he's very sophisticated. As a matter of fact, he's jaded almost. He's sort of satiated with life, and that's the total opposite of Henry. So what is he doing there? What does he know? What does he not know? what has his mother told him, maybe, or whatever. Actually, though, we're going to have to wait till next time to get all this until the very end of the novel.
That's another chapter, but maybe just going back to the context in which this backstory uh, unfolds or is revealed. And this, again, is, to my mind, a perplexing question. And I think I raised it in my latest Substack post on chapter 7. Grandfather Compson goes out to Sutpen's 100 because he gets word, and he goes out, I guess, with a bunch of other guys from Jefferson, that the architect has run off.
Yes.
This is the architect that Thomas Sutpen brought with him to Sutpen's 100. And he's been living there, well, I guess outside, with everyone else as the house is being constructed. And he's, been described as a little Frenchman who, wears kind of eclectic clothing, at least for Jefferson's taste. So there's this manhunt going on for the architect. And I was kind of questioning, why would Grandfather Compson feel the need to help Thomas Sutpen capture or recapture this architect?
Well, I think maybe the first way to answer that question, although it got several parts, I think, to it, is that as Quentin says to Shreve at one point, grandfather was his only friend. So apparently there's something in grandfather, General Compson, of a certain nobility. He doesn't reject Sutpen the way the rest of the community does. As a matter of fact, we know that he and he's before he's married, and then when he's newly married, they do get to know Sutpen. He and his wife, and so that's one reason. But gosh, I mean, it must have been quite a spectacle, to contemplate going with a bunch of men into the woods and tracking down this architect. I don't think that the architect was being held captive. We're not told why exactly he did come with Sutpen. Maybe he was promised something. Maybe he was of lesser status in France or wherever he was from. We don't know that he was from France, but just why he's there. But I think the way I read it anyway is that he's not imprisoned, he's not enslaved, and at some point he just gets more of that Mississippi mud and living outside like that than he can stomach, and he just has to go, in a kind of a panic, and that's why. And so, of course, in terms of the novel, that does give the occasion for Sutpen and General Compton to sit down on a log, right, and talk about it. And then Sutpen opens up to him, about this is my backstory. So I don't, but so much of that is kept secret from us, the reader.
Yes. Okay, so this backstory, where do we start? I guess we start when Thomas Sutpen is just a boy, uh, living up in the mountains of what is now, I guess, part of West Virginia, um, and living a very rugged subsistence level life with a father. The mother dies. I recall before they start moving, right before they get on the road and head to Virginia proper, to the coast. He's got two older brothers that have since left home, and a couple of older sisters, I take it, and uh, kind of just living hand to mouth. Father's a big drinker, so not a very happy childhood.
Um, Well, I mean, I think that's a good arguable point, Lori, that there doesn't seem to be any indication as he's telling it that he was any different from the other kids around there and that he was particularly unhappy. It was a rough life, certainly a rough life. And there were, I mean, I think of something like Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, the Walker Evans and, who was his partner, author there in that. But, and think about some of those pictures of back in the 1930s and how rough a life that must have been. And I think of that too in terms of the hill country. And Faulkner did know those hill people, and he knew that they were really rough. And as a matter of fact, in several of his novels, he talks about the Gowrie clan in Beat 4, he calls it. You don't want to go up there unless you absolutely have to, because you may not come out alive. And so, that's just the rough and tumble of that way of life. And there are hard drinkers, there are hard wrestlers. An argument was made when this book came out that was shot down by a couple of people pretty quickly. But these were, you know, critics of standing who said that Sutpen led a kind of an idyllic life in the hills of Virginia. And then, of course, but that's not really true because this was where, and you had it in the title of one of your posts, this is when they get down into the tidewater, they realize that they're no longer among the eye gouging, vicious fighters. And that was the way of life for them. It really was. You get a little of that in Demon Copperhead, in Barbara Kingsolver's novel, that kind of life. But it was a rough and tumble life. And there's that passage where Sutpen himself is talking about any man who would try to get more land than he himself could handle was a fool. He's going to get something bad happen to him. But that's all he knows, before they come down. And you're right. It's only when the mother died that then they, I guess, by sort of beginning, I don't know what made them move, but they start moving downward. And then, as you say again in your post, they fell into it. They fell into the tidewater. And what that means is they just came into the coastal region where there aren't any hills and mountains. So,
Right. And for the first time, it seems Thomas experiences a whole different class of people, these big plantation owning landowners, whereas before, when they were up in the mountains, everyone was dirt poor. But now there's a real distinction between those that have money and those who don't.
yeah. And the poor whites are very much aware, and this is really interesting about the South, both before and after the Civil War. The poor whites were always aware, that the enslaved blacks, for example, had better houses, had better food, better clothes, all of those things. And is that because of humanitarian feelings on the part of the white owners? Well, no, not necessarily. It's because that was where their capital was invested. And so just like they took care of their horses, they took care of their slaves. But the poor whites see that and they can't help but feel resentment toward the blacks. But it's interesting, and Faulkner captures this, I think, very well in chapter 7. It's not a personal thing from those poor whites to the blacks. It's just they sort of react to them as a class of people that they see. The real difference, real separation is between the planters, the landowners, and then those poor whites who farm their land, who farm the plantation owners' lands and keep them, in their wealth.
Well, I guess we don't really know whether Thomas Sutpen and his family had much, if any, interaction with blacks when they were living up in the mountains of West Virginia, right?
There aren't any. There are no blacks. And
So we,
well, I
I
was
was
going
just
to
going to
say,
say there is it seems young Thomas, once they get to the Tidewater area, he seems a little surprised at times about his older sister's reaction when they like encounter other black people like on the road, and how disrespectful she is.
Well, that's because they've heard stories that don't necessarily have any basis in fact that those black people are dangerous. So you want to keep away from them. And we live in the 21st century, but I at least can still remember stories like that from my childhood, that you had to be very careful, in that regard. So that's what those white poor women are doing. They're being very careful about, and they probably have been told by their brothers, by their fathers and uncles and everything, this is what you have to do.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
uh, but
So go ahead.
no, well, you go ahead.
No, well, I was going to jump to the incident, uh, the life altering incident that happens to young Thomas when he goes to deliver an errand on behalf of his father.
Yes. We don't know what his father was doing actually, but we assume that he had some sort of job on the plantation and something needed attention, although it never does become a factor, right? And so he just tells his son, go and tell Mr. whoever, that this needs attending to. And of course, Thomas did the same thing I would have done. You just go to the house and knock on the front door. And then, of course, what happens when he does is that a black man, big black man, comes to the door and tells him to go around to the back.
Yes,
And,
and
and
the
that,
and the the house slave that answers the door is dressed very fine,
yes. Oh,
and seems to look down on Thomas and tells him to go, yeah, to never come to the front door again. But even before that, Thomas is spying on the plantation owner.
yes, he is. Yeah. And
And
what's the plantation owner doing when he's spying on him?
he's
He's
he's laying on his back in a hammock having drinks brought to him by one of his slaves, and who's also fanning him from time to time.
exactly, and even taking his shoes off is requested, right?
Yes, yes.
So this is a way of life that Thomas can't, he can't get it because he'd never seen anything like this before. And this is part of what we are going to talk about. What we need to talk about is the innocence that he himself describes later on, or tries to anyway. So
Yeah. Larry, do you think the innocence here pertains to Thomas's shock that he's been told to use the back door from here on, or is is part of that innocence also his difficulty like processing it? I think Faulkner does like a really interesting job of trying to put us through this process where it's almost like Thomas senses that there's been an affront made against him, but doesn't even quite. It takes him a while to kind of understand, like, what's it all about.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and I don't really think it's an affront. And that goes back to his pre-watching, right? He's watching the man in the hammock. He doesn't feel envy. He
Right.
sees, it's in the same way that if back in the hills, one of them happened to own a really good rifle, it wouldn't be because he's superior to ones who don't own the rifle. And as a matter of fact, he would consider himself lucky and even sort of, indebted to show the rifle to those who didn't have one, and even the bullets and things like that about it. So there's no reason for him to think, at least Thomas Sutpen, to think that there's any kind of class circumstance here, any kind of superiority, inferiority, and so he just accepts it. The thing that gets him though is that he doesn't know what to do about it, and so he goes to that little nook, that he's a little cave in the by one of those game trails, that he's got that little stove hidden there, that when he takes the whatever he has to shoot and kills an animal, he cooks it there, and everything. But so he talks to himself. He says, but what can we do? What should we do about this? And then on one particular page, right in that section, it hits him like an explosion. And that's the word that Faulkner writes. It's an explosion. He knows what he can do to correct the situation. What is being asked of him? What is he even being called to do? And what is his solution?
Yeah, to just get a bigger house and more land than this guy had.
Yeah, and in other words, become like the man in the hammock. Now, but this is the thing. This is the careful thing that Faulkner makes us push at. Why? Is there a sense in Thomas Sutpen that he's underprivileged, or that he's inferior, that he's got to do this to make up for it? You think, maybe keep in mind Great Gatsby and Daisy. Why does Gatsby transform himself and get wealth and get status? Not for any other reason that he's in love. He's in love with Daisy. Well, there's what is it that motivates Thomas here? And this moves us toward the great irony of the novel, right? Because he says that he wants to get himself into a position from which, when a little boy comes to his front door, he won't send him around to the back. He'll let him in the front door. And what would we say about that? How does that sound? Now, we know that Thomas Sutpen is telling this to General Compson, but I see no reason to doubt his sincerity in saying that. As a matter of fact, there's a sort of a crude simplicity to Thomas Sutpen that makes you trust what he says. So when he says, I wanted to be someone who would not reject that little boy. And that's
he says over and over again that he knew something would have to be done about it.
Yeah. In order for me to live with myself. You wrote that. Yeah. That was good.
Yeah. So there's not a Daisy Miller here, but it seems that I don't know, Larry, do you think that we could almost say that there's some thought of justice in Sutpen here, that he just instinctually knows that something that he had to do something about it? I mean, I think that probably 9 out of 10 people faced with this situation and being, ignorant of how the world works, like Sutpen here, would just go off angry and resentful and maybe trying to lash out in unproductive ways. But his reaction here is different.
I think you could even call it noble, but I do think it, and you said that's not the way the world works. I think that this really is the sign of his innocence, right? That he does think this is the way the world works. And so when I read on page 210, if I could read just a little bit of that, when, he's talked to himself, but I could just shoot him, and then, no, that wouldn't do any good. but about a third of the way down page 210 in the Vintage International, telling grandfather that the boy symbol at the door wasn't it, because the boy symbol was just a figment of the amazed and desperate child, that now he would take that boy in, where he would never again need to stand on the outside of a white door and knock at it, and then not at all for mere shelter, but so that that boy, that whatever nameless stranger, could shut that door himself forever behind him on all that he had ever known, and look ahead along the still undivulged light rays in which his descendants, who might not even ever hear the boy's name, waited to be born without even having to know that they had once been riven forever free from brutehood, just as his own Sutpen's children were. So, he has this belief, and he's not very old, right? He's 14 years old,
Yeah.
and so, but it's a belief that he can do something to change the whole world somehow, by letting that little boy not stand outside the door. But then that opens up all possibilities for that little boy too. Now, okay, and I mentioned that I might as well just go ahead and jump into it, that this leads us up to the supreme irony of the story of Sutpen, because who does come, as it were, knocking at his door? Not a little boy, but a man, and his name is Charles Bond.
Yeah.
And what is he told? You can't come in this door. You have to leave. You cannot come through it. So, and I think that kind of confirms the quality and the nature of Sutpen's innocence, that he thinks um, he can arrange things just the way he wants them, and that's what he means by his design. I can sit down and figure out my design abstractly, and then it'll all come out the way I want. Because as he says at one point, if you put all the ingredients of cake together into the bowl, mix them up, and put it in the oven and cook it, only one thing could come out: cake. And it won't do. It won't work. And so this is what he now has to contend with, and it all goes back to the fact that he, in order to hold fast to his design and not depart from it, he has to do what with that woman of foreign origin and that baby that they both made in Haiti. What does he have to do? He's got to forsake them. He's got to separate from them.
Yeah. The of course, not letting Charles Bond in the front door, that's kind of metaphorical, not literal, because we do know that he lets Charles Bond visit several times, but we also don't quite know, or maybe, I guess we do get enough clues in this chapter to think that Sutpen was suspicious of Charles Bond from the minute Henry started writing home from college about him, right? I mean, Sutpen didn't need to see Charles Bond to suspect that he was his son, correct?
Yeah, and he hasn't seen him, right? When did he see him? When he was just a little baby, right? Before he then
Right, right.
came back here. So,
But as a grown man, I mean, it seems
and as a
that,
grown man, but I think that he does see, and there's a place, gosh, I don't know whether I can find it or not, but where he says, and he went to the door and he saw that face and he knew. So all it takes is that one
yes,
glance for him to know that this is the man that he deserted as a baby back then. And
right.
so you see how um, that major part of his design, which he thought he had cleaned up, right?
Yeah,
Because he had made restitution, he had provided for them, he didn't take all the wealth of the plantation and everything, but still, there was something beyond just the material part of what he had done for the mother and for the baby. It's something that is interior, it's moral, and it's spiritual. And we find out by the end of this chapter that this is why Charles Bond is there, not to get revenge, but somehow to come to terms with what has happened with this drama of which she has been a part, and then said, exit stage right. You're no longer part of this. And for Sutpen to really believe that he could dispose of that mother and baby that easily, again, is a testimony to his innocence.
Well, and also maybe a testimony to his innocence more so is the fact that it seems that Sutpen had no idea that this woman that he marries, that's Charles Bond's mother, actually had black blood in her, right?
Yes, yes. And Thomas makes a real point of that, right? He says, and it was withheld from me the one single thing that would have made all the difference in the world. If I had known it in advance, then I would have known what to do, and I would not have taken this step. So all I was trying to do was get back to my original design. And if they had been, and he's talking about the father, right? Because the baby couldn't talk, so he's talking about the father and his bride, his wife, that they could have very easily told him, knowing that he's from the South, knowing who he is, told him that they are foreigners and that his daughter has black blood. But he didn't. But neither one of them said that.
So, so I got in my reading of chapter 7 this suspicion that Sutpen has that perhaps it was, if not on the part of the now adult Charles Bond, then maybe on the part of Charles Bond's mother, some kind of revenge plot.
Yeah, I mean that's been speculated. Of course, we never meet the mother, right? She's never in the picture. She goes to New Orleans. We don't know how, and how she gets there. But I don't think it's ever. Now, again, we'll have to wait for chapter 8, because there's a lot of imagination at work there, and so that what you're just saying it is becomes evident there in parts of chapter 8.
Okay.
But in chapter 7, we are not given any reason for Charles's showing up in the first place. Not any indication that his mother has said, "Now go and take my revenge," or something like that.
Yeah, right, right. Although I do feel like in this chapter, Sutpen tells Compson something along the lines that he doesn't know whether it was just dumb luck that Charles Bond, ended up at Oxford, or if it wasn't part of some bigger plan. I'm probably not going to be able to find that part, but
You mean whether Thomas thought that it was some part of some bigger plan?
whether whether this intentionality on the part of Charles Bond and Charles Bond's mother, whether or not they had hatched this plan to get back at Sutpen or not. I thought that there
Yeah.
was something in this chapter, but maybe I misread it. But yeah, I'm sure we'll get more of that backstory as we get into chapters 8 and 9.
Well, one of the things, there's this passage where General Compson and Thomas are talking, and the talk goes toward destiny and fate, and whether whoever arranges all those things, the gods or whatever, were arranging something, and it just happened to come together like that. And Sutpen doesn't discount the fact that that might be the case. So, but we
Yeah.
don't ever know. That's one of the things that remains shadowy. Um, but in chapter 7, um, well, I don't want to leave part 1 too much. I just love the way Thomas Sutpen describes his time in Haiti. You see,
Yes.
and and the way is a sort of the economic language, right? So that they're besieged for what is it, 8 days, 7 or 8 days, and then one day that when they had run out of water and they had to do something or they would die, Thomas Sutpen simply put down his rifle and went out and subdued them, as it's put. He just goes out and subdues them. We don't get any details, you know. We don't know what he did, but they do quit, and I don't think probably that he killed them all, but that they leave. They leave them alone, and all this was after the really hard and bitter struggles between the blacks and the whites in Santo Domingo and in Haiti, but
Yeah.
so this was a sort of an aftermath of all that, but it was still serious enough, and you get the black magic in there, right? Or the voodoo, the evidences of that. And then apparently it was after that. Is this the way you read it? Apparently after that is when he and the woman married. She's very young, and I don't know, was her father planning then to, he owed his life to Thomas Sutpen and her life to Thomas Sutpen, so he was going to make Sutpen part of the enterprise, part of the family, and move on. And then, how did Thomas Sutpen know? How did he get the inkling that this was not what he thought it was? They were not just foreigners. At least the daughter wasn't.
Right.
We don't
I'm
know.
trying to I'm trying to remember. Was it only after the baby was born?
Yeah, and that's what I thought too. That he must have seen something in the baby, right? But we know that Charles Bond is not dark,
Right.
right? He's light colored. So I think that's part of the mystery. Somehow though he finds out, and maybe he just confronted the man, the owner of the plantation, but somehow he finds out, and I don't think
Yeah.
we doubt that he knows the truth about it. And Charles Bond showing up there, Charles Bond never denies who he is, but as a matter of fact, we don't know how much he knows.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the top of page 215 here in my version. I think we
Okay.
have the same version, Larry.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess this is Compson now, Quentin's father, narrating again. And uh, he says,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, and father said that even then, even though he knew that Bon and Judith had never laid eyes on one another, he must have felt and heard the design. I took that to mean he who must have felt and heard the design is Bon, right?
And where are you? Where are you reading? On 250,
Top of 215.
top of
Do you,
215.
do you see after semicolon and father said that even then?
Even though he must know knew, even though
Yeah,
he knew that Bond and Judith had never laid eyes on one another, he must have felt and heard the design. Oh yes, his design. House, position, posterity, and all come down like it had been built out of smoke, making no sound. So that gives that image of Thomas Sutpen even sitting down with pen and paper and writing out what he needed to have
right.
in order to accomplish his design.
And
And then
then it goes on to say, and he not calling it retribution. No sins of the father come home to roost. not even calling it bad luck, but just a mistake. That mistake which he could not discover himself.
Yeah.
So,
Yes. That's good. That's good. And I've got circled on that page. If you can
yes,
follow me, you might have too. I circled the word mistake and went down 4 more lines and circled the same word again,
yeah,
and then 3 lines and circled the same word again, then 5 lines again, and then the next line again. So right in that
yeah.
one paragraph, the word mistake. So it's not a sin. It's not some sort of moral failure. It's just a mistake. And so
So,
what? Go ahead. Go ahead.
no, I was going to say it would be interesting to see like the use of repetition in this chapter, because just like you highlighted how many times the word mistake is used there in one page, um, it seems to me that the word luck is used an awful lot in this
Yeah,
chapter as well.
yeah, yeah. It is. It really is. And I think part of that is because Sutpen has understood, even as that 14-year-old boy and on through his life, that he could avoid the consequences of just sheer luck. That he could rise above them, if it went against him. If he could just figure out and remember the two qualities that he tells General Compson that he needed: courage and shrewdness, those two. He says he believed that he had courage and that he could learn shrewdness if it could be taught, you know. So, and that was all that he would need in order to get this design underway. And, so then the shock of that, and you've taken me to the place that I was trying to remember just a little while ago at the bottom of 214, 5 lines from the bottom. This is when Henry brings Charles the first time. And
Okay.
Henry said, and this is toward the right hand side of the page, "Father, this is Charles." And he, the demon, Shreve said, and we haven't talked about Shreve yet. We got to before we get done with this. The demon, Shreve said, "Saw the face and knew that there are situations where coincidence is no more than the little child that rushes out onto a football field to play, but then he gets run over and everything, and but he emerges untouched, unharmed." So, and then he goes back into that on the next page, that fourth line from the top: "The forlorn, nameless, and homeless lost child comes to knock at it, the door, and no monkey dressed in anywhere under the sun to come to the door and order the child away." Right. So that's still an image sticks with him. This is kind of his North Star image, through all of this, that little boy that he was. So what what he doesn't say to General Compson, and I'm saying general, but he's not a general yet because this is before the war. But what he's saying is not "I was wrong, I'm sorry," or anything like that, but what was my mistake? And if I can figure that out, then I can go on with my design. And what does he do? Well, first of all, he invites Charles in. In other words, he doesn't tell him to go around to the back door. He
Right.
invites him in, even though he must have some sort of, I don't know, premonition about what might happen. Why is this man here? What is he going to try to do? And of course, Thomas can see from the beginning that Henry is in love with Bond, right?
Yes.
In that curious, and so he, from the very beginning, he sees that Judith and Charles should marry. And so he, as a matter of fact, the narrator says, well, I don't remember which narrator it is, it says, um, Charles Bond didn't court Judith, Henry did.
Yeah.
Because
Right.
Henry has that intention. So trying to correct that mistake is his passionate thing. One critic had written that, because another critic had said Sutpen hates, and then this other critic said no, Thomas Sutpen does not hate. He does not love, and he does not hate. And that shows the problem with who he is. Neither of those things.
Yeah.
So,
I wonder, Larry, and this might be, again, connected a little bit to the use of the word luck over and over in this chapter. Um, it, it almost seems to me that Sutpen is a believer in fate, which would run counter to this design, right? Because if you have a design, that kind of means that you feel like you've got the ability to overrun fate, right? Like the gods or the fate or whatever might be have determined one path for you, but if you have a design, that path is going to be the path that you make. But like, for instance, when we're talking about when Charles Bond shows up and Sutpen recognizes him and then knows for certain what he suspected previously, that, yeah, this is my kid. It seems that he just takes it kind of as fate that that Judith is going to want to marry this guy.
that Sutpen does. Sutpen takes it for granted.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. I think that he sees something. But I don't. So I see what you mean, and I think you're right. But I don't think that Thomas Sutpen is ready to knuckle under to fate. He still thinks that he can do it. As a matter of fact, one of the things that goes through his mind and what the narrator says is the reason that he didn't immediately act about this. That is to say, he didn't shut the door in Bond's face. He didn't do anything. He invited him in, and they stayed those few days. And then before Bond goes on, this is Christmas of 1859, and then sees him again in the summer. But because he starts talking about right about where we are in the book, he starts talking about a second choice that he has to make. He's got to make another choice, and this is whether to admit Charles as his son. I think that's the only thing I could figure out, because after all, Charles, as the narrator, as Mr. Compson has said, he could pass, and all Sutpen would have to do is give anybody who doubted that a crooked look, and then it would be silenced, so that he could even have Charles Bond's mother come as his wife, But of course, by this time, he's got a wife of his own, right? And two children. But that seems to be the choice that he's contemplating. And then, no, he sees another way to correct his mistake, another choice besides accepting Bond. And then that would be what? That would be Rosa. And so he goes instead to Rosa. And just
We know how that went.
We know how that went. That's right. Exactly right.
Well, let's talk about poor Wash Jones.
Mm.
And what he witnesses here that causes so we know that from our previous session that Rosa leaves. She's been humiliated, and she goes back home to her home where she grew up and lived most of her life in Jefferson. But then, Sutpen is still hell-bent on having a son, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where Wash Jones's granddaughter comes into the picture. But then it seems that this chapter ends with her having a baby, but the baby is indeed not a son. And so, as you so clearly stated last time, Sutpen thinks he still has one shot to have a male heir, right? A white male heir. And so uh, he he gets with the granddaughter and she has a baby, and then it's really a brutal ending here.
Mm. Yeah, it really is. And the thing that makes it even more brutal, or well, maybe I should say it takes the edge off that brutality, is that we see it happen through Wash's eyes, through his heart and his grief, because everything he has believed in, which has been focused in Thomas Sutpen, this is the man who had a hand wrote ticket from General Lee that he was brave, right? He's got it in writing. He thought that anything that Sutpen touched, he could make right. And so Wash hears him, say those words to Millie. Well, Millie, too bad
If
it
you
was a
were a
mare.
mayor,
Yeah,
yeah.
too bad you're not a mare. I'd have a decent place for you in the stable. And of course, we know that another reason that Sutpen's been out that morning is because his stallion, the mare that his stallion mated with, is about to foal. And that is another stallion. So he says, "Too bad you're a mare, Millie." And then Wash hears that, and it grieves him to his core. And he says, "Well, maybe it would be better that talking about Sutpen that your kind and my kind never lived on the face of the earth." And he really is in a suicidal way, and not only himself, but also the ones he's given birth to. So
Yeah.
his daughter is having died in a Memphis whorehouse, and here his granddaughter is taken up with and bewitched by cheap candy and beads by Thomas Sutpen, whom he thought was the bravest man in the world, all of nobility. And then he hears those words, and he picks up that scythe. And of course, the symbolism is almost too blatant, right? The Grim Reaper,
Right.
but he kills him. The interesting thing about that passage is the way we get the details of it from the black midwife who was there birthing Millie's baby.
Right.
But then she runs off and hides, and it's not but until a week later that they find her. And by that time, Millie's dead, the baby's dead, Wash is, and so is Sutpen. And then somebody gets the story out of her, and so we hear it from her, as it were, her mouth. Even though it's what she has related to somebody else.
So it was a little confusing to me about the newborn baby. Of course, Shreve is confused, right? Shreve thinks that Millie had a son, and it really was a girl. I was not having that same confusion that Shreve had, but I was a little confused as to who killed the baby and how that happened.
Yeah,
So I guess it was Wash that killed the baby.
yeah, yeah.
So
And that,
he
go
so
ahead.
just Wash kills Sutpen first, and then Millie, then the baby, then himself.
Yes. Well,
Okay.
he doesn't kill himself. I mean, what we learn later from
Okay.
a combination of the midwife, she's not fluent. She just probably got out the facts, and then Mr. General Compson is telling the story. But then, so a posse goes out. The sheriff, who is Major Despain, who is a character in other of Faulkner's novels, and his deputies go out there and investigate because they've heard that something's going on, because this little boy, whom Judith has paid a nickel to go out there, because Thomas Sutpen didn't come home last night, right? So sends the little boy to find out what happened. Little boy comes there and sees Sutpen's body lying in the weeds off the porch of the little fishing camp place where they live. And so then he hightails it back to Judith, and then Judith's the one who alerts Major Despain and the deputies. So then they tell Wash, he's all in the house waiting for them. He's been waiting all night for them, and they come, and he's in there, and he's with Millie and the baby, and they're still alive. And so then Major Despain says, "Come on out of there, Wash." And he says, "All right, Major, all right. It'll just take a minute, all right." And then he goes to Millie, and we hear Millie say, um, "I can't see you. Turn on some light. Light a candle." And then Wash says, "Hit don't take no light. It won't. It'll only take a minute." And so then we hear what others later say they think they heard the neck bone snap.
Yeah.
First of Millie, and then of the baby. It's brutal. It's really brutal. But he kills both of them, and then he goes out. He's not going to kill himself. He goes out and runs at Major Despain with the scythe, they think. But anyway, he's not. He doesn't intend to kill them. But then they shoot him and kill him. So there's Wash. So which is has been a sign all along that Sutpen certainly does not believe in this egalitarianism that he seems to be professing, thinking about the little boy going to the front door, because he won't even let Wash come in his door. Wash is always relegated to
Right.
the arbor, the grape arbor, where they sit and drink, or the Scuppernong arbor, I guess it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's very sad. I think in this chapter, two of the places that really are worthy of reading, I mean, all of it is, but then these two are worthy of not being skipped over, is this one, where we see Wash's inner being and the way he ends. And then when they finally catch the French architect, and the slaves, the half wild slaves.
Yeah.
Remember, this is back in 1834. Before Sutpen's 100 is built, and then they drag him out, and he's wounded. He's been architecting himself across from one tree to the next, and
Right.
then when Sutpen and General Compson recognize him and recognize what he has managed to do, then they take the bottle of whiskey to him, and then he salutes them with this amazing gesture, and then drinks the only drink of neat whiskey he will ever drink, and salute them.
I
So,
love I love the fact that Faulkner made the word architecting as a verb. Another that there's a passage here. I put it in the Substack post, but I think this almost it's another made up word by Faulkner, I think, in it, but it almost goes to the innocence, even to a more kind of foundational thing, because it's not only that Sutpen as a boy of 14 wasn't aware of the that you could be the same skin color as another white man, but you were not equal, that there were different classes.
yeah,
But this part just like breaks my heart. He says he still thought that was just a matter of where you were spawned and how,
yeah,
lucky or not lucky, and that the lucky ones would be even slower and loather than the unlucky to take any advantage of it or credit for it.
yeah,
And that's just that just seems to me like a double injustice, right? Not only do we have people that live down here and people that live up here, but that even the lucky ones uh, are are mean in their luckiness, because it's still not enough to make them nice, that
Yes.
they're the lucky ones.
Yes. As a matter of fact, it does the opposite, right? It makes them not nice, you
Yeah.
know, so their success. Yeah, absolutely. So, there's that brings up a bigger question for the first few years after this novel was published. A lot of critics said that Sutpen was an epitome of the Southern myth, right? He was Southern. And then after that initial spurt, then another strain of criticism came out that said, no, no, Sutpen is not at all Southern. He is American. He is modern man. And this is the kind of thing that modern man assumes, right? That he's naive and he's innocent, and thinks he can manipulate the world according to his abstract designs, right, and make it come true. And that's always stuck with me.
I
And
wonder, I wonder too, Larry, if not to put too fine a point on it, but that we would say that Sutpen is a modern American man, because, like you, I've read enough international literature, and it
yeah,
seems that um, a lot of times Americans, especially, are depicted as these people that think that they can fulfill their design, right?
yeah,
And there's a little bit of an innocence and naivety to that.
yeah, yes, absolutely. I think you're exactly right, and you're reminding me of this book that is still read and was pretty famous when it came out in the 50s, in 1955, and it was called The American Adam, Adam. And it says that America's founding in 1776 is breaking away from a traditional culture and thinking that it was starting history all over again, that it had no past, that it allowed them to do whatever they wanted to do, right, and mold things the way they thought they ought to be. And that's a very American way of looking at the world, so
Yeah, well, and that reminds me too of a much more recent book. I guess this came out in the early aughts, the Francis Fukuyama book, The End of History,
oh
right?
yeah,
Where it was like, oh, we're gonna, this is now that the walls come down and the Soviet Union's collapsed, everyone's just starting over again, and no one is going to have any of this legacy that they're going to be dragging around with them. And of course,
look at us now, look at us now.
right,
And you wonder what he thinks. If people ask him, well, what do you think about your book now? So,
right,
uh,
exactly,
but
exactly.
yeah, well, so anything else we need to say about chapter 7? Oh, I wanted to say also one other thing, and then I'm really through. Um, this is on page 214, since we're right where we were. And this is a sort of a prefiguration of what's going to happen in chapter 8. And that is that now Shreve and Quentin are talking back and forth, right? And one of them interrupts, and the other one says, "For God's sake, wait!" And things like that. And so then at one point, then on page 214, Shreve says toward the top of the page, "Your father," Shreve said, "he seems to have gotten an awful lot of delayed information awful quick after having waited 45 years. If he knew all this, what was his reason for telling you that the trouble between Henry and Bond was the octoroon woman?" And then Quentin says, "He didn't know it then. Grandfather didn't tell him all of it either. Like Sutpen never told grandfather quite all of it. Then who did tell him?" "I did." Quentin did not move, did not look up, while Shreve watched him. And it's so cold in this dormitory room, right? The day after that night when oh, Shreve said, "after you and the old aunt. I see. Go on." And father said a couple of things. First of all, that Quentin knew things that neither Quentin's father or his grandfather knew. And then how Shreve says, "and father said." So he's sort of morphing into Quentin.
Right.
They're becoming sort of coalesced here as they're talking in this way, making up things, when they don't have ready answers, and they're just putting things that are not facts, but as they seem credible and as they seem inevitable sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been a great discussion. I can't wait to to read on, because I don't remember a lot of details about the novel. So even though it's a reread for me, I mean, I remember the big plot points and the incest and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's just what a fascinating book.
It is. It's so fascinating. Yeah, it really is. And I love talking about it. So thank you for this.
Well, absolutely. And we'll talk soon, okay?
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye bye.